I asked Bianca's sister what changed after Aaliyah, and she said, "My sister was never the same." At first, I did not understand what she meant. I thought it was grief, something natural and temporary. But it was not. Something darker had shifted. After Aaliyah died, certain people suddenly gained power over everyone, and my sister sensed it before anyone else did. The world continued as if nothing had happened, but behind the scenes, the rules had changed forever, and she would never be the same. The day Aaliyah died, the air itself seemed different, as if it carried a weight that nobody could see but everyone could feel. I remember walking into the room where my sister had just received the news. She was quiet, almost motionless, her eyes fixed on a point that did not exist. At first, I thought it was grief holding her still, something that would pass in time. But it was not grief in the ordinary sense. It was a sharp, immediate awareness of a world that had shifted overnight. I stood in the doorway for what felt like an eternity, watching her breathe in shallow, measured intervals. The television flickered in the background, news anchors repeating the same information over and over, their voices blending into a distant hum. My sister did not move. She did not cry. She simply stared ahead, absorbing something I could not yet comprehend. It was as if she were watching invisible dominoes fall, each one triggering consequences that stretched far beyond what anyone else could see. People around her moved differently that day. Their steps were measured, their voices careful. Conversations that should have been filled with shock and mourning were instead filled with plans, calculations, and whispers that darted across the room like shadows. Nobody seemed to stop and process what had happened. Instead, they scanned the environment as if they were mapping a battlefield. My sister noticed it first, of course. I could see her observing, calculating, understanding things I was not yet ready to see. The phones rang constantly that afternoon. People arrived without invitation, their faces composed in expressions that seemed rehearsed rather than genuine. I watched them move through the space, exchanging glances that carried meaning I could not decipher. They spoke in low tones, huddled in corners, their body language speaking volumes that their words concealed. My sister tracked every movement, every gesture, every subtle exchange. Her mind was cataloging information at a speed that seemed almost inhuman. The most unsettling part was the subtle way power began to reveal itself. Certain figures who had previously blended into the background suddenly commanded attention without raising their voices. The presence of these people was magnetic and terrifying. Even a simple glance from them could make others hesitate, falter, or retreat. My sister did not flinch. She watched. She understood that something had changed, and it had nothing to do with loss or sorrow. It was about control. I remember the feeling in the room like a living thing, moving around us. It was thick and suffocating, yet invisible. Every conversation seemed calculated. Every smile was measured. People spoke in fragments, leaving questions hanging in the air that no one dared answer. The energy was oppressive. It was as if the tragedy itself had created a vacuum, and into that space stepped figures who understood instinctively how to seize it. My sister recognized it immediately, and I began to understand why she was never going to be the same. Even the atmosphere outside felt altered. The world continued its usual rhythm, traffic, music, laughter, but underneath, everything was different. People walked more carefully. Decisions were made faster, but silently. Rumors moved in hushed tones, and it felt as though anyone who questioned too much could disappear from that world without notice. My sister seemed to absorb all of this without a word, her expression unreadable, her eyes sharp and calculating. I realized then that she was learning a truth that nobody dared speak aloud. By the end of that day, I could see a subtle, irreversible shift in her. She did not smile freely. She did not ask questions. Her trust in people seemed to fracture, not completely, but in ways that would affect everything she did going forward. She understood the new rules before anyone even tried to explain them. But it was only the beginning. The unspoken rules were about to hit harder than anyone expected. And soon, those unspoken rules became impossible to ignore. What nobody realized was that the entire world was quietly being rewritten, and my sister was learning the lines before anyone else could speak. After that day, the world felt smaller, tighter, and infinitely more dangerous. My sister began to move through it with a caution that was almost terrifying to watch. It was not the caution of someone grieving. It was the caution of someone who understood that the rules had changed overnight, and nobody had told us what those rules were. I started noticing things I had never seen before. Conversations were no longer free-flowing. People paused before speaking, as if the words they carried could ignite invisible fires. Certain names could not be said aloud. Certain topics could not be touched. The air was charged with unspoken commands, invisible but impossible to ignore. The first thing I realized was that the change in power had created boundaries that were both fluid and rigid at the same time. Nobody wrote them down. Nobody explained them. They simply existed, like currents in the air. One misstep could cost a person far more than embarrassment. I could feel it pressing down on my sister as she moved through the room, nodding politely, listening more than speaking, observing everything with laser precision. It was as if she had learned a language nobody else knew, a language that revealed the truth of who could move freely and who was trapped beneath invisible chains. I spent hours trying to understand what she was seeing. I would watch her in meetings, study the way her eyes tracked certain people across rooms, notice how she positioned herself strategically in conversations. She was like a chess player seeing 10 moves ahead, anticipating consequences before they materialized. I tried to emulate her awareness, but I was always several steps behind. The invisible architecture of power that she navigated so expertly remained largely opaque to me, visible only in fragments and glimpses. I remember watching her during meetings, during conversations that should have felt casual. She was still smiling, but it was a calculated smile, one that weighed every shadow in the room. She asked questions carefully, almost surgically, and she answered questions with a precision that made it clear she had memorized the landscape of power around her. There was a sense of danger that accompanied every glance, every gesture. People who had seemed approachable before now inspired a quiet terror simply by existing in the same space. My sister understood this. She recognized who could bend the world with a single suggestion and who could be ignored entirely. One of the strangest things I noticed was the way certain figures suddenly gained an authority that seemed unearned. They did not shout. They did not demand. They simply existed, and the world moved around them. Their words carried weight, not because of volume or volume of accomplishments, but because people obeyed instinctively. It was terrifying to witness. My sister noticed it immediately. She observed their every movement, memorized their patterns, and began to navigate her life as if she were walking a minefield. I could see it shaping her, hardening her in ways that would follow her forever. There were moments when I wanted to pull her aside, to ask her directly what she was seeing, what she understood that I did not, but something always stopped me. Perhaps it was the look in her eyes, a warning that articulating these truths aloud could be dangerous. Or perhaps it was my own fear of confirming what I already suspected, that the world we had known was gone, replaced by something far more sinister and far less forgiving. This new order affected more than just conversation. It affected decisions, access, opportunities, and even survival. Those who understood the rules quietly accumulated influence. Those who did not risk being erased from important moments without anyone noticing. I could see the fear ripple through rooms like an invisible tide. People were no longer making choices freely. They were calculating each step, each word, each expression to avoid the subtle consequences of misreading a situation. My sister adapted faster than anyone else, not because she wanted to, but because she had no choice. Even outside of meetings and formal spaces, the rules carried weight. Social gatherings became exercises in observation and deduction. Parties, lunches, even casual encounters were now arenas where power was tested silently. The most chilling part was that no one ever explained why. Nobody dared articulate the hierarchy. It was all understood, internalized, and enforced without a single word. My sister became a master at reading these currents. She learned where to move, whom to engage, and when to stay invisible. It was not instinct, it was a survival mechanism, forged overnight by a tragedy nobody could speak of. I began to notice the effect on her demeanor. She laughed less freely. She trusted fewer people. Her presence was still warm enough to appear approachable, but it carried a weight I had never seen before. She had begun to internalize the rules, shaping herself to fit within the invisible framework that controlled everything. She was still my sister, but the person I had known had begun to vanish into someone sharper, more vigilant, and impossibly aware of the subtle hierarchies around her. The transformation happened gradually, yet it felt sudden in retrospect. One day I realized that I could no longer predict her reactions, that her responses had become so calibrated and strategic that the spontaneity I had always associated with her had disappeared entirely. She was operating on a level of awareness that most people never achieve, reading situations with a clarity that bordered on prescience. It was impressive, certainly, but it was also deeply unsettling to witness. And yet, this was only the start. The subtle rules were enough to control actions, but they could not control thoughts. My sister's mind worked faster than anyone around her, anticipating consequences before they arrived. She learned not only to survive within the system, but to predict its movements, almost as if she had become part of it. She could sense the shifts in power before anyone else, read the silent signals in a way that was both awe-inspiring and terrifying. Watching her, I began to understand why she would never be the same again. But then came the most unsettling realization. The new rules were not temporary. They were permanent. The people who had seized influence did not relinquish it. They became untouchable, unchallengeable, and the consequences of ignoring them were immediate and invisible. My sister understood this before anyone else, and she began to change in ways that were subtle yet irreversible. Her laughter became measured, her trust carefully rationed, and her every move a strategic calculation. And it was only after seeing this transformation that I realized what the next step would be: learning who could never be questioned, and understanding what it truly cost to remain visible in a world where invisible powers controlled everything. And then the untouchables revealed themselves, quietly claiming authority nobody dared challenge. My sister's understanding of them would define every choice she made, and the world would never look the same again. It was not long after the new rules became apparent that the untouchables revealed themselves. They did not enter rooms with fanfare. They did not demand attention with loud voices or dramatic gestures. Instead, they existed with a presence so commanding that it made everyone else pause without realizing why. It was subtle, almost imperceptible at first, but once you noticed it, it became undeniable. My sister noticed it immediately. She could feel the power radiating from certain people before anyone else could. She did not flinch. She did not retreat. She watched, learned, and measured. What made them terrifying was their invisibility. Nobody could point to an action that justified their influence, yet it was absolute. Deals moved differently when they were in the room. Decisions that should have been collaborative were quietly redirected by their mere presence. My sister understood this instinctively. She began cataloging who wielded authority without effort, who could bend the smallest moment to their will, and who would go unchallenged regardless of circumstance. It was a brutal lesson in observation, but one that became necessary for survival. I remember one moment clearly. My sister was in a meeting that should have been ordinary, a planning session like any other. The untouchables entered quietly, and immediately the room shifted. People who had been talking freely became cautious, nodding politely instead of contributing opinions. Every word was measured, every gesture was moderated. And my sister, seated quietly at the edge, watched it all with sharp, calculating eyes. She did not speak. She did not intervene. Yet in her silence, she absorbed the full weight of the hierarchy. That day, she learned a lesson that would follow her forever. Power is most dangerous when it does not announce itself. The meeting continued for another hour, but the dynamic had fundamentally changed. Ideas that had been presented confidently before the untouchables arrived were now offered tentatively, with qualifiers and disclaimers. People second-guessed themselves mid-sentence, their confidence evaporating under the weight of that silent authority. My sister took mental notes of everything: who deferred to whom, which topics created the most tension, how quickly people adjusted their positions based on the smallest nonverbal cues from those who held true power. Their authority was like gravity. People moved around them cautiously, anticipating outcomes before they happened. Mistakes that would have been minor elsewhere became critical missteps in their presence. I watched as my sister adjusted instantly, her body language precise, her tone careful, her reactions calibrated to avoid even the slightest misstep. It was not obedience born from fear alone. It was awareness, a recognition that these figures were untouchable, and that survival depended on understanding exactly how untouchable they were. The untouchables had a way of shaping the room without touching a single object. A glance, a pause, a subtle shift in posture, and everything changed. I noticed that some people laughed less, while others hesitated to share ideas. Opportunities were granted and withheld silently. Rewards and punishments were invisible but immediate. And through it all, my sister observed, memorized, and adapted. She understood that visibility itself was dangerous. To speak too much, to question, to draw attention to herself recklessly could make her invisible in the wrong way. By the end of several weeks, the pattern was clear. The untouchables had no need for conventional control. Their power was psychological, absolute, and terrifying. They reshaped meetings, events, and even informal interactions without anyone outside of their inner circle realizing it. My sister had learned to read these invisible cues. And in doing so, she began to change in ways that were subtle but profound. Her trust in others diminished. Her patience increased. Her awareness became almost superhuman. She was learning to navigate a world that few even realized existed. I remember feeling a chilling mixture of awe and dread. My sister was no longer simply reacting to events. She was anticipating them, predicting the movements of people who had become untouchable. She could sense tension before it existed, interpret the smallest gesture as a warning, and adjust instantly. It was remarkable and terrifying. The person I had known, who laughed freely and spoke openly, had begun to vanish. In her place was someone sharper, more guarded, and more acutely aware of invisible forces than anyone I had ever met. And yet, even with all her new awareness, the untouchables had not shown their full reach. There was still more for my sister to understand. Their influence extended beyond the room, beyond the building, and even beyond the immediate circles of people she could observe. It was a network, silent and ruthless, and she would need every ounce of her new understanding to survive within it. But what she did not know was that this was just the beginning. Understanding who held the untouchable power was one thing. Learning how to live with it, how to move through life without angering it, was something else entirely. And that lesson, I realized with a sinking feeling, would cost her more than anyone could imagine. And then came the warnings, silent, subtle, and impossible to ignore. My sister would learn that in this world, even a question could become a weapon, and the cost of speaking was far higher than anyone expected. The warnings came quietly, almost imperceptibly at first. Nobody shouted, nobody pointed fingers, but the message was unmistakable. Certain questions were dangerous. Certain topics were forbidden. Even raising your voice in curiosity could create consequences that nobody would explain. My sister understood this instinctively. She did not need anyone to spell it out for her. The atmosphere itself carried the warnings, like invisible hands pressing down on anyone who dared to speak too freely. And over time, I realized that these warnings were more terrifying than the tragedy itself. It started with small things. A subtle glance when a forbidden name came up. A pause, a shift in posture. A carefully chosen word that indicated someone had overstepped without anyone openly confronting them. People began to disappear from conversations, not physically, but in influence and relevance. Their opinions carried less weight, their suggestions were ignored, and gradually they were no longer present in critical decisions. My sister observed it all, absorbing every nuance. She learned that silence was a form of power, and speaking recklessly could be a liability far greater than anyone realized. The most chilling aspect was the calmness with which these warnings were delivered. There were no threats, no dramatic displays. Instead, a simple phrase, a raised eyebrow, or a subtle tone of disapproval communicated everything. And that disapproval carried consequences that rippled far beyond the room in which it occurred. My sister became keenly aware that to survive, she had to master the art of listening, of reading the unspoken, and of understanding the hidden boundaries before anyone else even noticed them. I remember one particular incident vividly. A colleague, new to the environment, asked an innocent question during a meeting. A question that brushed against one of the invisible boundaries. Nobody responded at first, but the tension in the room thickened immediately. The room felt like it had shrunk, walls pressing closer. The colleague stumbled over words, trying to recover. But it was too late. My sister watched from her seat, silent and composed, absorbing the lesson without a word. She understood instantly what had happened. The rules were not written. They were enforced silently, relentlessly, and without mercy. In the days that followed, that colleague's trajectory changed noticeably. Invitations to important meetings became less frequent. Their input was acknowledged with polite nods, but never acted upon. It was a slow erasure, so gradual that the person themselves might not have fully realized what was happening until it was too late. My sister watched this process unfold with the detachment of a scientist observing an experiment, cataloging every stage of the exclusion, understanding the mechanisms that drove it. It became clear that the rules were as much about perception as they were about action. Certain people could wield influence simply by signaling disapproval, and the rest of the room would align themselves instinctively. Decisions were guided by fear, awareness, and anticipation rather than dialogue or debate. My sister began to adjust every word she spoke, every question she asked, and every expression she displayed. She was learning that in this world, invisibility could be a shield, and speaking without caution could be fatal to one's career, reputation, or even sense of safety. Even social gatherings were subject to these invisible rules. A casual comment could carry consequences, depending on who overheard it, who was present, and who would report it back to the untouchables. My sister became a master of observation, noting every detail, every glance, and every subtle shift in tone. She began to navigate not just her work, but her entire world with an awareness that bordered on paranoia, and yet it was necessary. Survival depended on knowing what could be asked, what could be implied, and what must remain unsaid at all costs. What struck me the most was the cost of these lessons. My sister's laughter became measured. Her confidence was tempered by calculation. Even the smallest display of curiosity or emotion had to be filtered through a mental lens of consequence. She had become a student of silence, understanding that knowledge itself could be dangerous if wielded improperly. Every question carried risk. Every word had weight, and those who ignored the warnings suffered quietly, their influence eroding until they became irrelevant. By the end of this period, I realized that my sister had transformed. She was no longer naive. She had internalized the rules, the warnings, and the invisible power structures that dictated every action and every word. She was learning not just to survive, but to anticipate the consequences of every interaction. And that skill, while necessary, was shaping her into someone fundamentally different. And yet, even with all of her awareness, there was more she had yet to learn. The most dangerous lessons were still ahead, and they would test everything she believed about trust, loyalty, and survival. And then she realized that what appeared to be protection was actually control. The subtle chains were tightening, and my sister would discover that the cost of safety was far higher than anyone had warned her. It took some time before I fully understood the true nature of what was happening. At first, I believed that the restrictions placed on my sister were designed for her own safety. I thought that perhaps the careful guidance, the invisible limits, and the subtle instructions were meant to protect her from harm. But I was wrong. The more I observed, the more I realized that protection was only a guise. What appeared as care was, in fact, a method of control so sophisticated that almost nobody could detect it. My sister understood this faster than anyone. She could feel the weight behind every act of guidance, and she adjusted her behavior accordingly. It began with small, seemingly innocent restrictions. She was advised not to attend certain events alone, told to avoid some people in her circle, and subtly encouraged to maintain distance from others. On the surface, it appeared logical. Danger, after all, existed in every corner of her world. Yet the restrictions were far more precise than necessary. It became clear that they were designed not to shield her from harm, but to dictate her movements, her decisions, and even the people she trusted. The pattern was invisible to outsiders, but my sister saw it immediately. Every suggestion carried a hidden implication. Obedience was expected, and independence could be dangerous. What struck me most was the elegance of this control. There were no overt threats, no explicit commands. Instead, guidance was layered with nuance, framed as advice or concern. People offered cautionary words as if they were protecting her, but the real message was unmistakable. She had to comply. She had to adjust. She had to follow the invisible lines set by those who had the power to shape her environment. My sister internalized this quickly. She understood that survival required embracing the guidance while recognizing its true purpose. The emotional cost was immense. I watched her smiles grow rarer, her gestures more measured, and her conversations increasingly cautious. She had to weigh every word and action against the unseen framework of control surrounding her. Even moments that should have felt spontaneous carried calculated undertones. I realized that she was learning a skill nobody had taught her, the ability to navigate life within invisible chains while appearing free to the world. It was brilliant, but it was terrifying. Social interactions became exercises in careful performance. A casual laugh could signal rebellion if misinterpreted. A friendly question could draw subtle disapproval from those whose opinions carried unseen weight. My sister adapted instantly, calibrating her words, gestures, and even her expressions. She became a master of subtlety, her every action measured to fit within boundaries that were never stated, yet always enforced. The control was absolute, and she had to play along to maintain safety and opportunity. I began to notice changes in the way she moved through her day-to-day life. Even when alone, she carried the awareness of unseen eyes, of invisible expectations. Decisions that once would have been simple now required deliberation, foresight, and an understanding of consequences that were difficult to predict. It was as if her world had become a map of invisible rules, each one layered upon the next, all designed to ensure that she complied with the expectations of those who had seized power after Aaliyah's death. It was also clear that this control was not temporary. Those who enforced these subtle rules did so consistently, patiently, and without apparent effort. They did not need to threaten. They did not need to shout. Their authority was embedded into the environment itself, and my sister could feel it everywhere she went. She began to move with precision, predicting the consequences of actions before they occurred. She learned that protection could mask dominance, that concern could disguise manipulation, and that safety could come with invisible shackles. By the end of this period, my sister was no longer the same person. Her instincts had sharpened. Her trust in others had diminished. Every smile, every question, every gesture had become calculated, aligned with rules that were never explained. She understood that the cost of freedom was far greater than I had imagined. Every move had to be weighed against invisible consequences. Every interaction had to be considered carefully. Survival depended on navigating the invisible currents of control that surrounded her. And yet, even with all her adaptation, there was still more to learn. The Untouchables had taught her the framework of obedience, but she had not yet learned how far the cost of that obedience would stretch. There were lessons waiting ahead that would challenge everything she believed about freedom, trust, and the true meaning of protection. But learning to survive within invisible chains was only the beginning. The real cost would emerge when she discovered exactly what resistance could demand, and it would test her in ways nobody could foresee. By this point, My sister had learned to move through her world with a level of precision that was almost terrifying. Every interaction, every glance, every word was carefully measured. Yet the real test was only beginning. It was one thing to obey the unspoken rules, to navigate the invisible chains. It was an entirely different challenge to resist, even slightly, and survive. I watched as she encountered situations that required her to choose between asserting herself and preserving her safety. The stakes were high, higher than anyone outside the circle could imagine. The first signs of resistance were subtle. A small comment, a hesitant question, a flicker of disagreement. Each time she tested the boundaries, the consequences became clear in ways that were not immediately obvious. It was not punishment in the conventional sense. It was subtle, insidious, a quiet rebalancing of power designed to remind her of her place. I could see the tension in her eyes, the way her shoulders stiffened, and the way she adjusted her posture instantly. She learned that defiance, even in the smallest form, carried consequences that rippled through her life without warning. I remember one moment that struck me with fear and awe. My sister had dared to question a suggestion, one that seemed harmless on the surface. The response she received was almost imperceptible. A glance, a pause, a slight shift in tone. Yet the impact was immediate. Others in the room adjusted their behavior subtly, and she felt the weight of their attention like a tangible force pressing against her. She did not speak further, but her mind raced, cataloging the outcome, memorizing every detail. That was the moment I realized that resistance, no matter how small, demanded a level of calculation most people could not comprehend. She began to develop a sense of timing and instinct that was almost unnatural. She could predict reactions before they occurred, anticipate the subtle corrections that would follow a misstep, and adjust accordingly. Her mind became a map of potential outcomes, a network of decisions and consequences that she navigated silently. It was exhausting to watch, yet necessary. She was learning not just to survive, but to exist within a system that punished even minor miscalculations. What terrified me most was how quickly she adapted. Even when faced with the most subtle threats, she learned to bend without breaking, to comply without surrendering completely. Her awareness became sharper than ever, and her intuition for reading people and situations was almost preternatural. She could sense hesitation, deceit, and unspoken expectation in ways that no one around her could detect. It was as if she had developed a sixth sense for danger, for influence, and for control. Yet the cost of this awareness was evident. My sister's natural openness and warmth had been replaced by caution and calculation. Laughter was measured. Curiosity was filtered. Even trust became conditional, granted only when she could predict that it would not place her at risk. She was learning the price of resistance, the cost of testing boundaries, and the consequences of stepping even slightly outside the invisible framework of authority. And still, the most dangerous lessons lay ahead. Understanding the cost of resistance was only part of the journey. The people who controlled everything did not forgive mistakes easily, and the subtle repercussions of challenging them could echo for years. My sister had learned to navigate the system, but she had not yet encountered the full extent of its consequences. The knowledge weighed heavily on her, shaping her decisions, her demeanor, and even the way she perceived the world around her. And yet through it all, she survived. She adapted, she learned, and she became someone I could barely recognize. Someone far stronger, far sharper, yet undeniably changed. The cost of resistance had been paid, and the lesson was clear. In a world where invisible power ruled, survival required not only obedience, but a precise understanding of when and how to resist. And then she realized the most horrifying truth. The people who had gained untouchable power were not going to relinquish it. Their influence would last forever, and my sister's world would never be the same. Even after years had passed, the power that had emerged after Aaliyah's death did not fade. It did not diminish with time or distance. The people who had seized control continued to operate quietly, invisibly, but with a presence so absolute that nothing moved without their influence. My sister understood this as clearly as ever. She watched how decisions were still filtered through their unspoken authority, how their silent approval or disapproval could determine outcomes far beyond what anyone could see. It was terrifying, the realization that these people were untouchable. Untouchable not because of fame or talent, but because of a system so subtle and invisible that most never even noticed it existed. The extent of their reach became more apparent every time we witnessed interactions in spaces where power was at its most concentrated. Contracts, opportunities, even personal relationships were quietly shaped by the untouchables. They did not need to assert themselves aggressively. Their influence worked silently, like a current beneath the surface, guiding everything in its path. My sister's understanding of this influence had grown sharper than mine. She could see patterns, predict outcomes, and sense where their attention had fallen. The world around us appeared normal to outsiders, but the truth was far darker. It was impossible to overstate the stakes. Anyone who challenged their authority, even subtly, would feel repercussions that were both immediate and invisible. Opportunities vanished without explanation. Alliances shifted in ways that seemed random, but were carefully orchestrated. My sister had learned to navigate this environment with meticulous care, but even she could not fully escape the reach of these figures. She was powerful, observant, and cautious, yet the untouchables had built a system that transcended individual action. It was permanent, and it reshaped every interaction in ways that could not be undone. The emotional toll on my sister was evident. She carried herself differently now, measured in all things, and aware of the consequences of every word and movement. Laughter and trust were rationed. Decisions were weighed against invisible consequences. And yet, she continued to function, adapting and surviving in a world where even subtle disobedience could result in catastrophic outcomes. Her awareness was almost superhuman, but it was a heavy burden. The lessons she had learned were not abstract. They were a matter of survival, and the price of ignoring them could be devastating. It became clear that this influence was not temporary or situational. The untouchables had established themselves in a way that ensured their authority would endure. Their presence was embedded into the structures of power, invisible but omnipresent. My sister had witnessed firsthand that no apology, no compromise, and no talent could undermine them. They were permanent, like shadows that could never be chased away. And she understood that survival required more than skill or obedience. It required constant vigilance, calculation, and recognition of the invisible lines drawn long before anyone else realized they existed. And that is why my sister was never the same. The world she once knew, one of freedom, choice, and trust, had been replaced by one of invisible authority, silent manipulation, and untouchable power. She adapted, learned, and survived, but she paid a price invisible to anyone who did not see the currents beneath the surface. Aaliyah's death had not just changed the music world, it had shifted power permanently, creating figures who could control everything without speaking. My sister saw it, understood it, and lived within it. She survived, yes, but the world she navigated would never allow her the same innocence again. The rules had changed. The power was absolute, and she was never the same.